The court of Emperor Montezuma II was a world built on silence and gilded shadows, a place where power moved like smoke, and every gesture, every ritual, every breath carried the weight of centuries. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, behind walls painted with obsidian pigment and guarded by warriors who never spoke, stood the private chambers of the emperor, chambers that few living souls ever saw and even fewer survived to describe. Montezuma ruled not only with armies but with belief. His authority came from the gods, and therefore his body and the bodies of those brought before him were considered instruments of cosmic purpose. This created rituals feared even by the nobility, rituals whispered about in the markets and in the slave quarters, rituals that blurred the line between devotion and domination. The empire believed that the ruler was the living axis between the world of men and the world of gods. His blood could feed the heavens, his breath could cause storms, and his desires could shape omens. Because of this, every private act of the emperor became a ceremony. Nothing was natural, everything was sacred. And for those chosen to take part, these ceremonies could feel less like honor and more like a slow descent into terror. Those chosen were not randomly selected. They were examined from childhood by attendants trained to read omens in the way a person walked, or in the tone of their voice. Some were taken from conquered provinces, others from noble families seeking favor, others seized simply because Montezuma had seen them once in a procession and believed the gods had placed them there for him. They were purified in rooms filled with incense until they could not breathe. Their skin was painted with oils that marked them as offerings, not in a lethal way but in a way that stripped them of identity. Once marked, they no longer belonged to their families or even to themselves. They belonged to the palace and therefore to the emperor. The chosen were taught the ceremonies in silence. They were instructed never to look directly at Montezuma unless commanded. They learned to move slowly, to speak only when spoken to, and to obey even when the rituals frightened them. Some of these rituals were meant to test their strength of mind. Others tested endurance. Others tested submission to the intricate rules of the court. The terror did not come from abuse, but from the overwhelming force of the ritual itself. Every motion choreographed, every word predetermined, every moment heavy with the fear that one mistake could offend the emperor or worse, offend the gods. Inside Montezuma's private chamber, thick drapes blocked out the sun. The air was heavy with the scent of copal and crushed flowers. The emperor often sat on a raised platform carved with symbols of the celestial serpents, his face painted in deep red to represent divine fire. He spoke little, relying instead on gestures that his attendants understood instantly. For the chosen one, however, those gestures were cryptic and their meaning terrifyingly unclear. A nod could mean approval. A pause could signal displeasure. Silence could mean danger. Montezuma believed that the essence of a person resided not only in the heart, but in the hair, the breath, and the skin. Because of this, the ceremonies often involved the emperor inspecting the chosen with almost supernatural seriousness, not touching in a way meant for pleasure, but measuring them as if reading a message written on their bodies. The chosen would kneel for hours while attendants chanted prayers that curled through the air like smoke. Sometimes Montezuma would circle them slowly as if reading invisible signs. Those who trembled were dismissed and rarely seen again. Those who held still earned a place in the deeper rituals. These deeper rituals occurred during nights dedicated to specific gods, most often Tlaloc and Tezcatlipoca, whose domains included desire, fear, and prophecy. On these nights, Montezuma would call for a single chosen one to be brought into the inner chamber. The room would be lit by blue flames created by special oils. The drums outside would slow until the palace felt suspended between worlds. The chosen one would stand before the emperor wearing only the traditional cloak of offerings, a garment stitched with symbols meant to ward off the spiritual dangers of the ritual. The ceremony began with the offering of breath. The chosen would exhale softly toward a bowl filled with incense, while Montezuma watched with unnerving concentration. The belief was that breath carried truth and that the emperor could interpret intentions from how it moved through the smoke. If the smoke curled evenly, the ritual continued. If it broke violently, Montezuma would stop the ceremony and send the chosen away. Those sent away were not punished, but most never overcame the fear that gripped them after. They said, the emperor saw too deeply into the soul, and what he saw unsettled them forever. If the smoke passed the test, Montezuma would ask the chosen to recite a chant, not a prayer, but an ancient invocation said to call the attention of the gods. The chosen voice often wavered, not because of the words, but because during the chant, Montezuma would step close enough for them to hear his breath. He rarely touched them, but his presence was overwhelming, like standing beside a storm. The combination of fear, reverence, and the dim blue fire gave the moment a surreal intensity that felt as if the gods themselves watched from the walls. The final part of the ritual was the most feared. The chosen would kneel while Montezuma placed his hand near their forehead, hovering just above the skin. He believed he could sense the energy vibrating from the person before him, a spiritual current that revealed their deepest truths. Some said he could tell if a person lied simply by the temperature of the air around them. Others whispered that he could see memories flickering like flames. Whatever he truly sensed, it frightened those who experienced it. Some fainted, some shook uncontrollably. Others became completely still, as if frozen by a force beyond human understanding. It was during these moments that Montezuma made his decisions, whether the chosen would return for further rituals or whether their part in the ceremonies would end. Those he selected for return were treated with respect, yet also with fear, for it meant they had become central to rituals whose meaning no one fully understood except the emperor. Those dismissed returned to the palace quarters, shaken and silent, unable to describe what they had felt. What terrified many was not what Montezuma did, but what he did not do. His touch was rare, his tone calm, his movements slow, yet the atmosphere felt charged with something beyond the human realm. The chosen said that being before him felt like standing between life and death, between desire and dread, between devotion and destruction. Nothing happened quickly, nothing happened crudely, but everything carried the weight of power used, not for pleasure, but for control and spiritual dominance. And the most frightening truth of all was that Montezuma believed every moment of it was sacred, that the gods watched through his eyes, that he was their instrument, and that those who entered his rituals were stepping into a world that no longer belonged to them. And this was only the beginning. In the days that followed the first ritual, the chosen walked through the palace with a strange mixture of dread and awe burning beneath their skin. Many kept their eyes lowered, afraid that even a passing glance from a guard or an attendant would mark them as unworthy for the next ceremony. Others stood taller, believing that surviving their first night in Montezuma's chamber meant the gods had acknowledged them. But all of them felt the same thing, a lingering sensation that their spirit had been touched by something far older and far darker than the empire itself. The palace reacted to them differently too. Servants moved aside when they approached. Priests watched them with calculating eyes. Warriors, who normally did not concern themselves with palace matters, seemed to study them, as if trying to see what Montezuma had seen. Some whispered that the chosen carried a fragment of divine energy, now a mark left on them by the emperor. Others said the opposite, that they had been emptied, that Montezuma had taken something from them without ever laying a hand on their skin. The truth remained hidden beneath layers of ritual and silence. When the second night came, those chosen again were taken not by force, but by ceremony. Attendants placed thin bands of jade around their wrists, a sign that they had been called deeper into the emperor's private rites. This time the path to the chamber was different. They were led through a corridor lined with carvings, so old that even priests hesitated to interpret them. Scenes of gods binding mortals with threads of light, scenes of warriors offering their hearts to celestial serpents, scenes of women standing at the edge of fire pits, their hair braided with symbols of surrender. These carvings glowed faintly in the torchlight, as if remembering the countless eyes that had stared at them in fear. At the end of the corridor, a curtain of woven gold hung from ceiling to floor. 2 guards lifted it without speaking, and the chosen stepped into a room unlike any they had seen before. The air was still. The walls were painted with jaguars whose eyes seemed to flicker with life. In the center of the room stood Montezuma, his back turned, his cloak spreading across the floor like a dark river. He did not greet them. He did not turn. He simply raised one hand and the attendants withdrew, leaving the chosen alone with the emperor. The silence lasted so long that it felt like a weight pressing against their lungs. Then Montezuma spoke, but softly, so softly that the chosen had to strain to hear him. He asked a single question, a question that was repeated in every ritual, though its meaning remained elusive. Why do you fear the gods? The chosen were expected to answer in their own words, not recite prayers, not repeat teachings, but speak truthfully. Most stammered, unsure of what he wanted. Some said they feared divine punishment. Others said they feared not being worthy of divine attention. A few said nothing, and Montezuma tolerated their silence, as if silence itself contained a message. Once he heard their answers, he turned to face them. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with intensity. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate and heavy with purpose. He told them that fear was not weakness, but the beginning of surrender, and that surrender was essential to the rituals that followed. Then he lifted a bowl filled with shimmering liquid. The chosen recognized the scent immediately. It was pulque, the sacred drink made from the maguey plant, but mixed with herbs known only to the royal priests. This drink did not intoxicate the body, it intoxicated the spirit. Those who drank it often described visions so vivid that reality slipped from their grasp. Montezuma offered the bowl to each chosen one by one. They drank because refusal was unthinkable, and because the emperor watched them with eyes that seemed to pierce through every hesitation. The liquid burned at first, then numbed the tongue and finally spread warmth through the chest and head. The room began to shift. The torches flickered in strange rhythms. The jaguar eyes on the walls seemed to blink. The patterns painted on the floor twisted until they looked like serpents coiling around the chosen feet. And through it all, Montezuma remained perfectly clear, his presence carving through the haze like a blade. He told them to kneel, they obeyed. He told them to close their eyes, they obeyed. What happened next was the part of the ritual that the chosen feared most. Montezuma placed his hand on their heads, not gently, but with symbolic weight. He did not push them, he anchored them. He told them that the gods were near, that they were watching, and that the chosen must allow their spirits to open. The pulque made this feel possible. Thoughts loosened, memories drifted. The boundary between body and mind blurred until the chosen could no longer tell whether they were kneeling in the emperor chamber or floating above themselves. Montezuma spoke in a language older than Nahuatl, older than the empire itself. His voice rose and fell like wind moving across mountains. The words carried images, not meanings. Images of fire-consuming temples, images of rivers turning to blood, images of celestial beings binding mortals with threads of light. The chosen could not understand the ritual, but their spirits reacted as if the words pulled at something deep within them. Some began to tremble. Others swayed as if caught in a current. One collapsed entirely, their face pressed to the floor as tears ran silently down their cheeks. Montezuma did not comfort them. He did not touch them further. He simply continued speaking until the visions intensified, until the chosen felt as if the walls themselves breathed. When he finally stopped, the silence struck like a blow. The chosen opened their eyes slowly, the room spinning for a moment before stabilizing. Montezuma looked at them with calm intensity. He told them that the gods had looked into their spirits and found either strength or weakness. The verdict was never spoken aloud, it was felt. Those who sensed acceptance felt an overwhelming peace, as if a heavy weight had lifted from their shoulders. Those who sensed rejection felt dread sink into their bones, a dread that would haunt them long after the ritual ended. But Montezuma was not finished. He summoned attendants who entered carrying small obsidian mirrors polished to perfect darkness. The chosen were instructed to look into the mirrors. What they saw did not always reflect their faces. Some saw distorted shapes. Others saw flickering shadows. A few claimed they saw Montezuma's eyes staring back at them from within the mirror itself. These visions were the emperor's way of reading their hidden fears and hidden desires without the need for physical touch. The chosen were then told to whisper their deepest truth into the mirror. Not confession, not desire, truth. Something that defined them. Many struggled, some cried, some could not speak at all. Montezuma watched each one with unblinking focus, as if the mirror revealed far more than words ever could. When the mirrors were taken away, the chosen were exhausted. Their spirits stretched thin, their bodies trembling from the strain of the visions. Montezuma dismissed them with a gesture, and attendants guided them back to their chambers, where they collapsed into restless bed sleep haunted by dreams that felt more like memories than imagination. And as they slept, Montezuma sat alone in the chamber, surrounded by the obsidian mirrors. He studied each one as if the chosen truths were now etched into the glass. He whispered to the mirrors. He asked the gods to reveal the meaning. He believed the rituals were shaping not only the chosen, but the fate of the empire itself. Because Montezuma was convinced that the gods spoke through human bodies, and that understanding the chosen meant understanding the future, and the rituals were becoming darker, and stranger, and far more terrifying. The deeper the chosen passed into Montezuma's rituals, the more the palace around them began to change. Not physically, but in the way it felt. Corridors seemed darker, echoes lingered longer than natural. Servants hesitated to speak to them, as if fearing the touch of something invisible clinging to their skin, and everywhere they walked they felt eyes watching from behind curtains and carved stone. It was as if the palace itself recognized them now as vessels caught between the mortal world and the world Montezuma believed he communicated with. The emperor summoned them again, but this time he sent no attendants. The message arrived through whispers. A young servant approached each chosen at different hours of the same night. No words were spoken, only a gesture toward the inner halls. The meaning was clear. Montezuma wanted them alone. They walked through the sleeping palace one by one, passing torches that burned lower than usual and doorways where shadows clung like spirits. When they reached the sacred corridor, the golden curtain that marked the entrance to Montezuma's deepest chamber was already lifted, waiting for them like an open mouth. Inside the chamber, the air was colder than before. Incense still burned, but faintly, as if the smoke struggled to rise. The blue flames had been replaced by a dull red glow cast from stone bowls filled with embers. They flickered like hearts struggling to beat. Montezuma stood in the center, not wearing his usual ceremonial cloak, but a simpler garment of white cotton marked only with a single black stripe across the chest. The simplicity made him more terrifying. Without the layers of authority, he looked less like an emperor and more like a man possessed by purpose. He motioned for the chosen to form a circle around him. They obeyed without hesitation, though fear churned inside them. The emperor closed his eyes and began to chant in the ancient language again. His voice was deeper, now rougher, as if carried by something other than his own breath. The walls responded. The painted jaguars shimmered. The serpents on the floor shifted. The air vibrated in a way that made the chosen feel as if their bones hummed. Some swayed, though their feet did not move. Others felt the ground tilt beneath them, even though the chamber remained perfectly still. Montezuma stopped chanting and looked at each chosen in turn. His gaze lingered on their faces long enough to fill them with dread. He told them that tonight was the unveiling, the moment when the gods would decide which of them would continue in his sacred service and which would be released. But the word released did not feel like freedom. It felt like erasure. He lifted a small obsidian blade, not sharp enough to wound, but polished enough to reflect distorted light. The chosen stiffened, fearing what the emperor might demand, but he did not touch them. Instead, he traced symbols in the air with the blade circles and spirals and sharp intersecting lines that glowed faintly as he moved. The symbols vanished as quickly as they appeared, but the sensation they left behind lingered like static against the skin. When the last symbol faded, Montezuma instructed the chosen to step forward one by one. Each had to stand before him with their head bowed, their hair falling forward like a curtain. He placed his hand inches above their scalp, not touching but close enough for them to feel the heat radiating from his skin. He spoke softly, words that sounded like questions, but carried no clear meaning. The chosen answered automatically, not knowing if the emperor heard their voice or their thoughts. Some answers made Montezuma close his eyes in approval. Some made him pause. Once he stepped away abruptly, as if something unexpected flickered through the chosen spirit. The chosen nearly collapsed from terror. No one spoke. No one dared ask what had gone wrong. Then came the second trial, the one most feared. Attendants emerged from hidden doorways carrying pottery jars sealed with wax. They placed them at Montezuma's feet, then withdrew as silently as they had entered. Montezuma broke the seal of the first jar. A faint hiss escaped, along with a scent the chosen recognized instantly. The sacred herbs again, stronger this time. He dipped his fingers into the mixture and flicked droplets onto the floor. The embers reacted immediately, flaring bright red, then sinking into a deeper glow. Montezuma instructed the chosen to sit around the circle of embers facing him. He told them to keep their backs straight and their eyes forward, no matter what they saw or felt. The herbs took effect within minutes. The chamber darkened, the embers pulsed like living eyes. The air thickened until breathing felt like inhaling water. The chosen vision blurred, then sharpened unnaturally. Shapes in the corners stretched into towering silhouettes. The shadows of Montezuma's gestures twisted into serpents and jaguars that crawled along the walls before evaporating. Then the visions began. One chosen saw their own reflection split into two, one staring blankly, the other screaming without sound. Another saw Montezuma transform into a skeletal figure wrapped in serpents. Another saw the chamber filled with warriors who had died centuries before, their faces painted with grief. None of them understood whether the visions came from the herbs or from something Montezuma had summoned. The emperor watched their reactions closely. He did not speak. He did not chant. He simply observed, as if scanning each chosen for signs the gods had marked. As the visions intensified, the chosen struggled to maintain posture. Some trembled uncontrollably. Some whispered fragments of prayers they barely remembered. One tried to rise but collapsed almost immediately, overwhelmed by the heavy air. Only when several seemed at the edge of collapse did Montezuma raise his hand. The visions stopped, like a flame snuffed out. The chamber returned to stillness. The embers dimmed. The shadows resumed their natural shapes. But the chosen knew something inside them had changed, something subtle and irreversible. Montezuma walked around the circle slowly, as if inspecting offerings at an altar. He paused behind each chosen, placing his fingers near their necks without touching. He said nothing aloud, but his silence carried meaning, judgment, decision, fate. When he returned to the center, he announced who would remain under the god's gaze. He did not name them. He only pointed. Those he chose felt a mixture of relief and dread. Those he dismissed felt a different terror, the terror of not knowing what their dismissal meant. But Montezuma was not yet finished. He told the remaining chosen to stand. They obeyed, though their legs shook. He instructed them to place their hands over their hearts. They did. He stepped closer until they could hear his breath again, warm and steady. He told them that they had been accepted not because of their fear, but because of what lay beneath it. The ritual had revealed the truth of their spirits. That truth bound them to him now, to his service, to his visions, to his divine purpose. Then he turned to the dismissed. He told them they were free. But freedom in Tenochtitlan was not simple. Those dismissed walked away pale and silent, knowing that the emperor had looked into their spirits and found something he did not want. Some never recovered from that knowledge. They said it was like carrying a shadow that never faded. The remaining chosen, however, were led deeper into the palace, into chambers even more secret than the one they had just left. There their training began, not physical training, but spiritual conditioning that would shape them into instruments of Montezuma's will. They learned to control their breath, to silence their thoughts, to obey commands without hesitation. They learned to walk between the world of men and the world of gods. And Montezuma himself watched their progress. To him, these rituals were not cruelty. They were preparation for a divine future only he could see. But to the chosen, the rituals became a labyrinth where fear and reverence intertwined until they no longer knew which guided their steps. The ceremonies grew darker with each passing week. The visions stronger, the expectations heavier, the emperor presence more overwhelming. The chosen no longer lived ordinary lives. They lived in the shadow of something greater and far more terrifying. All because one man believed the gods whispered through desire, through fear, through ritual, and through the souls of those he gathered around him. And as the empire moved toward its tragic fate, Montezuma continued his ceremonies, convinced that the gods watched every moment, and that the chosen were the key to prophecy. They did not know then that the greatest terror was still coming, not from Montezuma, but from the world that would soon collide with his rituals and shatter them forever.